The House and Senate passed a bill to raise the debt ceiling and cap government spending for the next 2 years. I'm Rosemary Miller here with Kelly Phillips Erb, a tax lawyer and Forbes editor. Thank you so much for joining me, Kelly.
Thank you for having me.
So, Kelly, this is clearly a bipartisan bill, and we don't see that a lot these days. Can you tell us why do you think this was a bipartisan bill?
I think there are two factors. I think one is that although there was a lot of posturing by both sides, ultimately they both understood that the results of not suspending or raising the debt ceiling could be pretty devastating for the economy. It would mean that the United States would default on its bills, and that's something we've never done in the modern era. So I think both parties saw the value in reaching an agreement. So I think that's part of it. And I also, I give a lot of credit to President Biden and Representative or House Speaker McCarthy, who sat down and kind of, hammered out these details before it went to the floor. They came to an agreement. I think it was something that, again, you heard a lot of grumbling about when it happened, but ultimately both sides saw that it was something that was going to be acceptable to their parties, and so they moved forward. So I think it was both, the spirit of understanding how important it was, and then a lot of behind the scenes work that kind of propelled it forward.
So, could you tell us what's actually in this bill? I know in your story you had about 11 points of things we need to know. What are those things?
Sure. Well, I think the one thing that we should kind of mention is that people were kind of confused about the spending part, right? So I think people kind of conflated this with, are they working out the budget? They weren't working out the budget. What they were doing is they were putting restraints on spending, which is a little different. So this isn't like a line by line budget, but they did address some very specific spending areas. So one that got a lot of play before the bills went was Medicaid. There was a lot of pull on the GOP side that they wanted to have a work requirement for Medicaid put into place. And that did not happen. So there was no change to Medicaid funding. However, the work requirement did find its way into other funding, specifically SNAP funding. And SNAP is what we call it, like in everyday chatter, we call it food stamps. It's basically assistance to families for food. And there are existing work requirements, but there is a lower cutoff age-wise. So this would actually expand it. It's quite a narrow window. I think ages 50 to 54 over the next few years. But what it also did was it carved out some exceptions, and that was a bipartisan agreement that if they're gonna have additional work requirements, then we should do something to make sure that the people that are the most vulnerable are protected. And so there are protections in place for vets, for example, homeless persons, and foster youth. So those folks were insulated from the changes. But overall, SNAP, there are now work requirements.
Okay, so Kelly, what about the TANF benefits? You mentioned that in your story as well.
Sure. So TAMP was another point of contention where there was a lot of concern about who was going to get what. And the TAMP program is interesting because it's a federal program, but it gives money to states to distribute. And the concern was that states weren't meeting certain targets, and that there were also maybe those targets were a bit too low at this point. So what happened on the federal side, which is just more programmatic than it is actual dollar limits, is that the Fed said to the states, we are going to require you to change the way that you report, and we're also going to look at the numbers before we give you the money. So it's not, again, it's not they didn't take a red line and say we're going to eliminate, $100 million from this program. They just changed the way that they're going to be distributing those funds. And as a result, that should keep a little bit of a cap on spending.